I'm Tim. Thank you all for being here. So we're going to talk about brand storytelling, but first let's kind of introduce each of you. Love to hear just a little bit about yourselves and what brings you here, and what brand storytelling means to each of you. Veronica, I'd love to start with you.
So I'm Veronica Civiero. I'm working in Italy for L'Oreal, and I'm responsible for the influencer strategy around 15 brands that invest in it. Regarding your questions regarding brand storytelling, I think that it's an interesting topic, even for a big company like L'Oreal, because it's an issue that we are facing, a very big issue. And this because companies are used to talk about product and about campaigns, and less about the story behind the campaign. So we are really trying to make the marketing teams understand that we need to do a switch between a focus on product to a focus on the story, and also on the emotions of the community. And this is not so easy to do.
Yeah, that's why we're on stage, so great. Steve?
Awesome. So hi, everyone. My name is Steve Kearns. I lead social media strategy on behalf of our advertising business at LinkedIn, and I also support our Sales Navigator product, if any of you are familiar with that. I've been with LinkedIn about 3 years, based in New York City, but from Los Angeles, so it's wonderful to be home. Love the director's chairs. A fantastic, welcome back to Los Angeles for me. To give a little bit of thought on brand storytelling, I couldn't agree more with what you said in terms of, there's really a lack of trust in marketing today. I think we're facing consumers, we're facing B2B buyers, whomever your audience is, who really doesn't believe in brands anymore. They hear a message and they're like, wait a minute, this is inauthentic, this is not relevant to me. And stories are really a way to almost circumvent that, or flip the narrative and share information that is brand relevant, but is also going to resonate with your audience. How do you think about telling a story or adding value to something that is relevant to your product, relevant to what you do, but not necessarily, to your point, a product pitch, or hey, look at this, we have X, Y, and Z. So really excited to dive into this chat.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. Nazir?
Hey guys, my name's Nazir. I'm the social lead over at Notion USA. Oversee the Genesis Motors brand, which is the newest luxury automotive giant right now. And I've come from a variety of different agencies, being the social kind of guru team leader. And it's been that person that's always fighting for that seat at the table at very much traditional 360 agencies. I think for brand storytelling, especially for Genesis being the new kid on the block, it's so important for us to tell brand stories, because people don't know who we are and they don't really want to know who we are. There's other options for you that have legacy and heritage, like the bigger names, all the German names. But so Genesis, we have to create that emotion with people.
Got it. So brand storytelling is one of those terms that I kind of struggle with. It feels kind of loose. I have a hard time figuring out, okay, what exactly is brand storytelling? What's different between brand storytelling and kind of, advertising as we've known it for however many, decades, if not centuries. I'd love to, hear from each of you, like an example of brand storytelling that you've seen, either that you've worked on or that you've just seen out there in the market that kind of really crystallizes for you what brand storytelling is or what it should be. Veronica.
Okay, so for example, in Italy, we are really working on tell the story about Garnier. That is a brand that has a lot of history behind and a strong community on bio, so on all the natural things. And we realized that people were interested in products, but they were more interested on all the story and the moods and the values of the brands. And a lot of time, also when we do questions to our consumers, focus group, and so on, we understood that people really don't know who is the brand. So if you don't tell the story, you have a problem at the end of consistency, and also about how consumer perceive a brand. So we are trying to tell the whole story, and we are trying to focus on consumers' needs and passions, because at the end, if you don't communicate to consumer telling a story on their passion, their needs, and so on, you're going to lose them because the competitors are so strong that at the end of the day, you're going to not do a good job.
So what's the output of that? Is that TV ads that are told a certain way? Is it influencer posts that are crafted a certain way? What does that look like?
I think that it's a mix. I think that even the traditional advertising need to switch in some way because at the end the consumer is the same in front of TV, in front of influencer, and so on. So I think that every touch point need to try to tell more the story of a brand. So for sure, influencer can help a lot because influencer, of course, are more human. So they can really help us to tell the story and values of a brand and so on. But at the end of the day, even traditional advertising that was like, hey guys, this is the product and you have to buy it and full stop, has to change. Because consumers are not interested anymore in that type of content.
Got it. Steve, what's an example of brand storytelling pops to mind for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think it goes to say, when you start thinking about brand storytelling and how we are starting to think about it at LinkedIn, you almost have to shift the focus away from the brand and think to, who are your users, who are your members, who are your customers, who are your brand advocates who are going to help you tell that story. So specific to an example that we had at LinkedIn, we did a bit of research years ago, and we said, what do people think of the LinkedIn platform? And that, of course, disseminates into like all of the different things we sell, ads, our learning solutions, talent solutions, so on and so forth. And we found that people didn't, really know how to connect to the brand. There wasn't sort of that emotional response when people said, oh, LinkedIn, that's a place I love, that's a platform I love, that's a platform I love to go to. So our answer to that was a campaign we actually called the In It Together campaign, and that's something that you can see live on out of home, on social, paid media, so on and so forth. And that's really a campaign for us that was intended to highlight the stories and sort of the professional opportunities on the LinkedIn platform. So for example, we sort of turned the microphone over to our members and we said, hey, what is the opportunity we have to tell their story? Obviously LinkedIn is the connector in all of that. So, you're not going to get an ad where you're not flashed a LinkedIn logo or, obviously the brand has some kind of investment in that. But again, it is allowing our members, our customers to say, hey, here's the value of LinkedIn, here's what I learned, here are the jobs that I found, here are the opportunities that I found. And that is a lot more authentic than say, us or myself going onto an ad and saying, hey, I'm with LinkedIn, we sell ads, we have jobs, whatnot. So again, turning the microphone back to the customer, to the member, which is really seeing sort of that lift in brand perception that we were looking for.
Nazir, what about you? What examples of brand storytelling?
Yeah, so for me, storytelling is like emotions, right? We talked a little bit about connections, and we talked a little bit about creating a network, and typical ads, like you were saying, is like, here's a picture, buy me now. And we see that especially on social. There's different website cards and link ad cards and carousel units that can definitely drive traffic and awareness and get that lift. What we don't get is you don't get that emotion, right? So when I think about storytelling, I always think about what's gonna make me post that thing on Twitter that's gonna be like, I'm not crying, you're crying, right? Like, and I just got married and I celebrated my 2-year anniversary yesterday, and thank you. And so I always look for brands who are really making me think about life stages and making me think about who I was before, who I am now, and where I'm going. And so I loved working on campaigns. We did a really cool project when I was at RPA for Honda, where we told a story about finding a lost dog. And we all can relate to this thing where you find an animal and you're doing everything possible to like help it and foster it or find it up for adoption. And we created this really cool 5-series stories where we were able to kind of programmatically serve it up to people. So maybe you saw 1/5 of the story or 2/5 of the story, and you like were yearning for more. But at the end of it, it was that we wanted to draw you into the fact that he delivered that dog back to that little girl, and so it got people to tears. It brought people to move. So,
Got it. And so, brand storytelling. One thing I'm trying to understand is like how new of a thing this is versus this is something that's been going on for decades. We just have maybe a newer term for it, or a term that kind of crystallizes it. Is this a new trend, or is this just, hey, we found a name for this thing?
For me, it's a new trend in the way we can do it. I mean that given that we have all the social media platforms and we have several touch points with different objectives and so on, we really can explode brand storytelling. When we had in the past the TV commercial ads, you had just like 30 seconds to tell to consumers the whole story. And it was pretty, I mean, not so easy to do, because at the end of the day, the time was, you have a few seconds and so on. So today, we really can tell the consumers the whole story between the several touch points. And I think that we need to try to understand how to build the whole message, giving different informations in the several touch points and not the same on all the platforms, because as we said before in the last panel, we had different objectives for every platform. So at the end of the day, you can tell the story, try to give different emotions and different connection on several touch points. So I think that this is really different versus the past.
It sounds like it'd be really hard today, because like one thing I hear about all the time is how difficult it can be to reach people these days. Audiences are so fragmented. And so it seems like it's hard to reach people just one time, but then to try to sequence it out to tell a full story, seems like, how would you even begin?
We are trying to work a lot on L'Oréal International, not just Italy, on data. So we are trying to work with Google and Facebook to create one single consumers on the several touch points. And we are really trying to collect email, so data and email and contact to create one single experience. We are not there at all, but we think that in the future, this is the direction, because at the end of the day, you need, as a brand, you need to know what you're going to communicate to each consumers. And if you don't know in which platform the consumer goes, you cannot do it.
Steve, I'm going to jump past you real quick, because Nazir, obviously you work with brands. Yeah. What's been your experience in kind of how to stitch together a full story across all these different platforms, given challenges that you can face in reaching people?
Yeah, totally. So I think the way, to address your first question, storytelling has been since the dawn of times. Like, we gathered around campfires. I hear people tell stories. And when TV campaigns came up, like, we talked about how can we tell a story in that 30-second spot. And so when I now, like, working with brands, is how do we tell a story that's like seamless, that goes through that customer journey? And where it used to be this kind of like V shape, right? And now it's just like an infinity loop where at any moment we can really touch them in any one of those kind of transactions, whether it's pre-transaction, post-transaction. And so for a brand, especially working at an agency where traditional agencies are very like TV focused first, and like, okay, this is going to happen here, but then how do we weave and kind of back into like what's going to happen for CRM and what's going to happen for social? It's like, take that brief and rebrief what that actually might look, so you don't actually have this like matching luggage thing. So for Genesis, being the new kid on the block, we're going on our 3rd year of being in business as a separate brand. It's this, we know we're this like up and coming brand that's very in this like David and Goliath kind of way. And so our campaign that we brought forward is kind of this thing called Born to Rise. And we're born to rise up, and we kind of naturally feel that everybody in themselves has this Born to Rise kind of mantra that you're kind of like brought up in. And so what that looked like in TV was great, but what it looked like for influencers was having them tell their specific story and how they overcame those obstacles. So, and we saw that differently on digital, and how can we leverage influencers in maybe what would be a static banner ad, or maybe putting that TV spot on something like Eater. We leverage an influencer to help tell their story, so it actually matched that Eater platform.
Good. Steve, what are your thoughts, especially LinkedIn being one of the pieces to these broader storytelling campaigns?
Sure. Yeah, and it was so funny. We were talking earlier in the green room about how especially in the B2C space, less so for B2B. LinkedIn is kind of the oft-forgotten social platform, or almost the underdog of social platforms, and we're kind of out here now really trying to educate, to inspire, and to show the value of the platform. Not only for marketers, but obviously for members as well. And it's interesting. I was at a conference last week, and I'm going to steal this from what I heard there, but brand storytelling, I think, is a relatively new term and concept because the marketing mix has changed so much. We used to have, like 20, 30 years ago, before I was even alive, I've been told that, we used to have, it was events, it was PR, and it was out of home. Now you have to divide that pie among so many other things. You have SEO, SEM, paid media, organic social, so on and so forth to really help tell that story. So the question that we always like to look at LinkedIn, and we advise our clients, especially on the marketing and advertising side, to look at is what is that overarching story that connects all of your different stories or business seeds or business objectives? Because at the end of the day, if you're seeing 10,000 marketing messages a day, I think that's kind of the stat that people have been harping on lately. You're going to be confused as a consumer, as a member. If you're getting just bombarded by messages, what is that one takeaway you want to have of that specific brand? So that's something we're laser focusing in on, and we're saying, what do we want our advertisers to understand about LinkedIn? What do we want them to understand about the LinkedIn platform as a whole? And I would say, for marketers, advertisers on the platform, we always like to espouse the fact that especially considering a lot of the drama going on in the social media space right now, we're really proud of the community we've built, the supportive community we've built, and a community that allows sort of that like brand safe environment for folks, especially B2B brands. If you're looking at things like financial services, if you're looking at professional services, that is going to be the sweet spot on LinkedIn because you're really able to reach that professional community who comes to the platform in a mindset that's not like, hey, let me go look at this cat video. I'm actually putting myself out there professionally. So, that yields a different kind of engagement. It yields a different kind of, message and brand context that you're putting out there.
Got it. And so I'm curious, like brand storytelling being something of a new thing, what's, especially Veronica and Nazir, I'd love to hear from you, the process in determining, what story a brand can tell, and then how to go about telling it. And then Steve, I'm curious to hear from you, like when you kind of hear then from the brands, like about their stories, how to go about implementing it. But Veronica or Nazir, who wants?
This is a super interesting point because what we are trying to do is to divide the story, to shape the story of the brands based on tribes' interest. I mean that the brand for sure has a singular story, but then you need to understand which tribes you want to target and to shape, to modify the story a bit based on the tribes. So,
and by tribes, you just mean audience segments, or is that a specific term for something?
Yes, because inside our community, there are a lot of audience, a lot of tribes. And each of these tribes has completely different interests. So we are trying to talk about the story of the brands based on tribes' interests. So at the end, it's not one single story that can be used for every audience, but we are trying to build several stories based on this interest. So it's really, it seems easy to do storytelling, to tell the story of the brands, and it's done, and it's not. Because if you really want to have the attention of the consumer that you have in front of you, you need again to talk about passions, interests, things that really interest to these people. And so you need to study the tribes. And this requires data for sure, this requires time, and so on. So for me, brand storytelling is not just tell the story of the brands and go on with a whole story with values and so on, but more understand the consumer and tell them the brand story based on this.
Got it. Nazir, for Genesis, what was the process like in determining the brand's story?
Yeah, I think we had to look back at like Genesis being such a new brand. Like, what were the brand pillars for the brand? And Genesis being a Korean brand, then we looked at, okay, as a Korean brand, what's the culture and integrity kind of behind what the Korean culture is? And so when we looked at kind of the brand pillars and then who Genesis was, and obviously who their parent is, Hyundai, we kind of developed that brand story of like, okay, we're this newcomer. And to Veronica's point, it is difficult because there's so many different avenues where you could tell that story, and so you're almost iterating micro versions of that story to all hopefully make one story up, right? And for a new brand, that's hard because you're building a brand at the same time you're trying to launch a product. And so what's the product's message versus the brand's message, and how do you get people to connect the two?
And so, Steve, how does LinkedIn then come in there when you hear about those kinds of challenges?
Yeah, and I think zooming out, I can hopefully speak for social media in general, but thinking about the idea of consistency. As we were talking, one of the ideas that came into my mind, or one of the brands that I admire, was Coca-Cola, and I immediately thought of that. Obviously their brand story, their brand promise has evolved over time. However, for the most part, you understand what value they're delivering to their consumer, what story they're telling. And that is super, super important as you're thinking about what is this core or overarching narrative that we can then start to pull and disseminate and iterate on based on the different audiences, based on the different platforms. So as you're thinking of that from a distribution perspective, I always like to advise on consistency over breaking the internet. I do not want to break the internet once as a social media manager and then be completely forgotten about. I would rather build trust, build consistency, and build a message that people can recall in an instant, and that takes time, that takes years, that takes money. It takes a lot of kind of just pounding the pavement. So, what does that look like tactically on LinkedIn or any other social platform? Posting every day. These are things that's kind of baby steps, one in front of the other. How are you building a consistent audience on organic social first, and then applying paid media to kind of tinker and reach those more targeted audiences and expose your content to more people. Because obviously, we again at LinkedIn don't like to say, okay, come to our platform, start a LinkedIn page, for example, on behalf of your brand, if you're an influencer. Don't start a page on behalf of your business, so to speak, and then immediately start spending money. We say build up that organic audience, understand who your audiences are, and then you can start to build that messaging and target that messaging because you don't want to be wasting that money per se. So definitely get really consistent on your sort of overarching message, build the organic audience, and then start to think about how you can apply those paid strategies to that.
And so coming up with a brand story sounds like a big overarching thing that then gets executed. And I imagine it's not just a single campaign running in a given month. This is probably more than a year, or at least
Years.
a year. Okay. That feels like a big bet. And so, you could create the brand story, think you have a great story to tell, and then you go out with it and it doesn't really resonate. What do each of you do to kind of check the value of a story ahead of time to make sure, okay, this is the story that we should be telling?
For us, we do a lot of focus group and consumers interviews because we think that, yes, for sure, data and KPIs can help us, but when it comes to the story of the brands, that really, it has a real value for us, considering also the brands that we have inside our company and the story that they have behind them. So we think that we need also more qualitative data. So first, for sure, we are going to look at all KPIs that we have on social platforms and so on. And then we ask for feedbacks with brand lift, consumer interviews, focus group, and so on. And I have to admit that we spend a lot of money on this. On consumer research and on consumer feedbacks based on campaign, on storytelling of the brands. We spend a lot because we want to be sure that at the end the message that reaches the consumer is the one that we want to tell. And it's not always the case because it's so complicated to put together the message of a campaign, then the message of a product, then the message of the brands, and think about that everything together work in the right way. So yeah, it's quite a mess, honestly. Even when you have more of a, we have brands with so different kind of products and line inside the brands. For example, I can think about Lancôme that has a product for the working lady, then the super millennial, then so Even the brand is complicated, and then you have to put together all the message. So you need to be sure that the storytelling of the brand is clear. So for this, from my point of view, you need also qualitative data and to understand what consumers think after the campaign. And for these reasons, we're working with a focus group, consumers interviews, and then all the qualitative data that we can have.
Got it. Steve, you were nodding a bunch.
Yeah, it's so funny. We go through this every day, and I actually just had a conversation about this yesterday because we're thinking about identifying ways to launch a new, let's say, like research series. So, for example, how a lot of companies have like the Edelman Trust Barometer or the Business Insider Digital Trust Report. Eventually the goal would be LinkedIn has an incredible wealth of data. How do we make that accessible to other people to be a thought leader in the space? So, we're trying to decide how to disseminate this story, pick a narrative, whatnot. My first piece of advice for everyone in the room would be don't let executives or those with influence or whatnot bulldoze through a story without understanding the data behind it. There are a couple options for how do you understand that data. The first is, obviously focus groups, thinking about any sort of market research, testing how a message will land in a market. I'd say for smaller firms, probably what's more of a scalable way, and one of the ways that we're going to try to test this narrative is, going to market with, let's say, 3 to 4 potential messages, and keeping everything consistent. Let's say the creative, basically everything but that like text on the image or that message. And we're going to see, sort of pressure test or A/B test what message is landing the best. And there are a number of different channels you can do that on. You can do that on organic social. You can do that on paid social. You can test that narrative at conferences with, what we call at LinkedIn an NPS score, basically like a customer satisfaction score. And then you can start to iterate based on that. Obviously it's not going to be the full report that you would necessarily get if you spend, a boatload of money with, let's say, like a market research firm. But, that would be a way to understand, okay, here's who's following me right now, here are the tribes that, I want to reach, and then, working backwards to understand, what message they're resonating best, and that's when to kind of go all in on that message.
Nazir, for a new brand, I imagine the process could be a bit different for you than it would be for L'Oreal, where there are all these brands that people are very familiar with. Is that like what Veronica was saying about their approach? Is that very similar to how Genesis went about it, or were there important nuances?
No, no one knows who we are. So we don't have that problem. But as a new brand, it's like, okay, what's the voice? And so when you talked about bulldozing, I kind of chuckled inside because we have team of strategists and creatives are like, this is what the brand is and this is what it's going to look like. And it, for social, when I originally commented on like trying to fight for a seat at the table, it's very much that. Social is the wild, wild west. And there's really no new and fast rules for how social should be. And so when we looked at one of our cards, it's like, oh, this person that buys us cars, over 55 years old and makes this household income. It's like, well, great. Well, why don't you put that on Instagram? It's like, well, our Instagram audience is 18 years old. But then how do we mold that card to like get the 18-year-old to like it, right? So the insight we found was that, well, 18-year-olds really like Supreme and Gucci, right? So like, let's make our cars like super extra luxe the way Bentley does. So we like partnered with Vanity Fair and made a really cool custom G90. So it was a two-tone paint with alligator skin interior. And what we got was the highest engaged vehicle on our platform. The people can't buy it, but the awareness was there.
Look, future customers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I grew up with a Mercedes poster on my wall as early as 10 years old. And it was something that I aspired to buy and to have and to drive one day. And as Genesis being a new brand, we need to start planting those seeds. And though we do that on different platforms is really unique, right? And so that's what's really cool about building a brand is you really have an open landscape to do that.
And so that raises an interesting point, like with brand storytelling. I'm curious about how you measure the effectiveness of brand storytelling, and obviously, brands run businesses. The end goal is for people to buy whatever the product is. That may not be the goal of each individual, campaign or ad, but at some point the idea is to move person farther along so that maybe one day when they're old enough they can buy a Genesis, or the next time that they need a certain product they'll think of Lancome for that product. How do you think about evaluating the brand stories that you're telling and the effectiveness and striking that balance between brand and performance?
So this is a very easy question, right? No. I think that there isn't, I mean, we cannot have one single KPI to measure the value of brand storytelling and the effectiveness on this. We are trying to put together several KPIs. For example, we know that people that watch the whole story of the brand spend more time on a brand website, brand contents, and so on. So we are putting together KPIs that can be for awareness, and then also KPIs on conversion. And we are trying to look at the whole picture, I mean, all together and not on singular KPIs. We don't have, I think that we are not still there, because at the end, what the management want is one single KPI, and we don't have it. And spend a lot of time looking at all the KPIs and all the data that we have is not always so simple. Also because of the culture that we have on the culture that we have on digital is not so advanced. So not everyone can understand all the single KPIs that we are looking at, view to rate, viewability, and so on. But today, I think that to understand the effectiveness of the storytelling is the only thing that you can do. Because at the end of the day, it's not about conversion, and it's not about awareness. So, and it's also not about engagement. It's everything together. And so. Got
it. And then, Nazir, like an auto brand, being able to judge the effectiveness, I mean, it's a long purchase cycle, especially if it's an 18-year-old and you're waiting for them to turn 24 or 28, be able to afford a car.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. When I had the opportunity to work on Honda, I think what they did really well was that they were able to align with life stages. And I talked a little about life stages when I talked about storytelling. And for me, it's like finding brands that are able to help me align with a life stage. So for Honda, it was really easy. Like, you have your entry-level Civic, right, that you get in right when you're 18. Maybe you got a used one, and you kind of like stuck with that brand loyalty. And then you grew up, and then you got into an Accord, and then you had a family, and now you got into the Passport or the CRV, and now you have like 3 kids, and you're like lugging around an Odyssey, and you're a van dad, right? So for Genesis, we're looking for how can we align the brand value with that person. So for our Born to Rise campaign, it's aligning people who also feel like they're breaking into a new spectrum. Maybe they're entrepreneurial. Influencer marketing is really a strong point for us, because influencers in themselves have had to overcome so much. Even if you look at just from like a bullying standpoint and like how people talk about influencers, it's like, how do they kind of break out into that space? And so for Genesis, how do we break out into that space? So KPIs are really different. It's the entire time I've been in this space, it's like, give me more followers, and then give me more views, and where's my engagement? And now it's the discovery score discussion of like how many new people are actually seeing and talking about the brand. And so I think you can measure it in like brand lift. I think that's a really good opportunity for you to measure.
Steve, what are your thoughts on evaluating the effectiveness?
Yeah, it's so funny that you mentioned that. We actually look at something called this like engagement tracker, brand engagement tracker, where we look at who are the competitors or the big brands that we want to be like, and we want to have that similar sense of mind share, and how are we tracking toward that progress. Now, there are a number of different like core metrics that roll up into that big KPI. So is it engagement rate? Is it people who are in a focus group saying, hey, do you know this brand? Do you know how to use it? Whatnot. So that's kind of what our true north metric is. Obviously, that's very hard to quantify as you get into a very big business and start looking at lines of business and what contributed directly to that. Was it social? Was it out of home? Was it this event that I came and spoke at? Whatnot. But to Brian's point earlier, we think about a lot of this. It's kind of the luxury and the curse of being a mega brand. What is the value or what is the consequence you pay if you don't start thinking about this. You're not planting those seeds, to your point, around building those long-term relationships with customers and prospects. You could end up on the wrong side of the road or the wrong side of the equation very, very quickly. So, obviously that's not the narrative that's going to get the check signed, so you have to get a little bit more in depth as to what you're measuring. But, to your point, it's so much bigger than just thinking about, what you, or is it an engagement play? Is it a conversion play? It's sort of that broader, overarching, message story that you're trying to tell people, and how quickly people can recall that, and how much that sticks with them.
So we only have a couple minutes left. Love to finish off each of you. Like if you could share a piece of advice or a tip that you've learned over the years, especially brand storytelling being a newer thing, that you think would be important for anyone who's doing brand storytelling or is trying to do brand storytelling or is just trying to wrap their head around this topic, that would be important for them, or that you wish you had had when you first set out on this. Who wants to go?
Okay. So for me, it's to. I think that every brand needs to forget the message about the product and focus on the community and on the story they want to tell for that kind of community. So I think that we need to stop a bit about just telling about the amazing products that we have, and listen more to our consumer and our communities. Otherwise, we are going to not talk anymore with them, and we're going to lose them.
Okay, Steve?
That's so important. I love the concept of community, listening to the community, because obviously, especially as LinkedIn, if we didn't have a community, we don't have a business. So I'd say my advice specific to social media would be, take risks. You're not always going to get it right. I think we are always scared in the back of our heads to be like today's IHOP or today's Pepsi or whatever brand screwed up on social media that day. But unfortunately, high risk, high reward. So if you are not willing to put yourself out there, put your brand out there in sort of an informed way, what we like to say are taking intelligent risks at LinkedIn. You're not going to be able to get that traction, and you're not going to be able to relate to folks on that person-to-person basis that people expect from brands today. So definitely be open to taking risks, and if you fall, just get up quickly.
And then Nazir.
Yeah, I think you hit it. It's the social. I'm going to be a Valor for social media for a second, and just it truly is the wild west. You can do something yesterday and then literally dust yourself off and do it again if you wanted to. You can delete it, re-upload it. The consequences can be high, but the reward can also be really high. So I think for brands, you need to skew and put more effort, more than ever now, in influencer marketing and experiential. I think experiential and social media are in bed together. The experiential marketing acts as for brands kind of content hubs, and it kind of helps them tell their stories outside of TV and break through the screen. And for a lot of times, you're able to actually touch the brand. And the beauty of social media is that it's no longer this one-way street. It's a direct community talking relationship. And it's the brand talking, it's influencers talking for you, it's PR that's talking. And it's the only real platform and the real vertical that you can have that one-to-one back and forth. So.
Got it. We are unfortunately out of time. Thanks to the three of you, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.